Welcome to this explainer. So, have you ever felt that tension between what we often think of as the rigid, ancient rules of the past and the more modern concept of grace? It's a dichotomy we hear about all the time, right? The idea often pits the Hebrew scriptures directly against the apostolic writings. But what if that whole tension is actually based on a massive historical misunderstanding? Today, we're going to explore how the research of Mark Bates completely challenges this binary way of thinking. We are looking specifically at how ancient law shaped morality, not as some strict, overbearing system of punishment, but as a deeply dynamic framework for actual human flourishing. Okay, let's dive right in. Here is the quick roadmap for our journey today. First up, we'll tackle the law versus grace myth. Second, we'll look at Torah as covenantal wisdom. Third, the heart of ancient morality. Fourth, Jesus, allegiance, and ethics. And we'll wrap it all up with liberty, not license. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the law versus grace myth. It is time to do a little deconstructing of this binary. To really get this, the research suggests we've kind of got to take off our modern post-Enlightenment glasses for a second. See, modern Western theology often artificially chops the biblical canon into this opposing binary. You've got law way over here and grace way over there. But to see where we went wrong, we have to contrast our modern, abstract Western view of law with the highly dynamic Hebraic concept of a living covenant. When we in the West think of law, what comes to mind? We think of exhaustive penal legislation, right? Cops, courts, external codes, punishment. But the ancient Hebraic worldview wasn't governed by those static abstractions. For them, law was divine instruction. It was covenant guidance. It was basically a roadmap for hitting the mark of holiness. You can actually see where the mix-up happened if you look at the etymology. When the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, the rich word Torah was rendered as nomos. Now, while nomos did mean custom or instruction, it carried some really heavy civic and legislative baggage. It essentially introduced a rigid, legislative concept that over centuries of Latin and English translations completely distorted that original gracious Hebrew meaning. So the real game changer here is understanding the true etymological root of Torah, which is the Hebrew word yarah. It literally means to shoot an arrow or to point out a direction. I want you to just imagine shifting your concept of ancient law right now. It wasn't designed to be this restrictive, punitive cage that locked people in. It was given as a guiding compass to a people who had already been redeemed, pointing them in the right direction for how to live beautifully together. Which brings us to section 2, Torah as covenantal wisdom. Let's look at this through an ancient Near Eastern lens. To really grasp how ancient law shaped morality, we have to completely step out of the 21st century. If we step back into the ancient Near Eastern cognitive environment, we see that ancient legal collections like the Code of Hammurabi or the Torah were absolutely not exhaustive statutory codes. An ancient judge wouldn't be frantically flipping through a giant book of codes to hand out a sentence. Instead, these collections were illustrative, paradigmatic models. Basically, they were wisdom literature. They were meant to shape a community's moral imagination, teaching them how to apply divine wisdom to everyday relational and economic situations. Moving on to section 3, the heart of ancient morality, we are going to look specifically at Leviticus chapter 19. Let's see how all this wisdom actually builds into real-world ethics. We can anchor this whole theory in a really tangible example by looking closely at Leviticus 19. Now, this text is often totally dismissed today as just an irrelevant ancient rulebook, but the source points out that it is actually the beating heart of ancient morality. Look at these micro-narratives. Farmers were instructed to leave the edges of their fields unharvested for the poor and the immigrant. Merchants were strictly required to use honest scales. The community was explicitly forbidden from cursing the deaf or tripping the blind. Think about that. These agricultural and civic rules were actually profound relational ethics, brilliantly designed to protect the absolute most vulnerable members of society. The source material argues a massive core thesis here. In ancient law, horizontal ethics toward our neighbors were seen as a direct, undeniable reflection of vertical holiness toward God. You literally cannot separate loving God from making honest business deals or caring for the disabled. They are organically, inherently unified. All right, section 4, Jesus, allegiance, and ethics. Let's talk about what it means to fulfill the law. Now, we absolutely have to address the elephant in the room. If ancient law was so foundational to morality, didn't Jesus just abolish it all in the New Testament? Well, according to Second Temple idioms analyzed in the research, when Jesus said he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, he was using a very specific rabbinic phrase. Back then, to abolish or nullify a law meant to misinterpret a command and lead people into disobedience. But to fulfill meant to interpret it rightly and establish its true intended practice. So Jesus wasn't throwing out the ancient compass. The research suggests he came to authoritatively interpret and embody its true original intent. To fully grasp this dynamic, we have to redefine the Greek word pistis, which we usually just translate into English as faith or belief. In Greco-Roman and Jewish literature, pistis was never just a passive intellectual agreement to a set of facts. It wasn't just nodding your head. It meant enacted allegiance. It was an active, embodied loyalty to a sovereign king. So following Jesus wasn't just about mental assent. It was a call to an active, enacted allegiance that naturally produced obedience. We actually see this exact enacted allegiance in Jesus' famous triadic teaching structure. It goes like this. First, he quotes the traditional surface-level interpretation. You have heard it said, do not murder. Second, he exposes the sinful trap at the root of the heart. But I say, if you are harboring anger, you're already caught. And third, he offers a transforming initiative. First, go and be reconciled. He transcends mere external rule following to demand a radical, spirit-empowered renewal of the human heart. It's a whole new level of morality. Which brings us to our final stop, Section 5. Liberty, not license. Let's look at Pauline ethics. So, how did this ancient moral architecture translate to the diverse, rapidly globalizing Greco-Roman world, specifically through the writings of the Apostle Paul? Well, here is a fascinating piece of history. In the ancient city of Corinth, which was basically known for its sensuality and massive pagan temples, some early believers started throwing around this popular libertine slogan, "Everything is permissible for me." In Greek, that's panta moi existin. They were essentially trying to use the concept of grace to justify boundless physical indulgence, basically claiming that because of grace, what they did with their bodies just didn't matter anymore. So we have to ask a pretty crucial question here. When Paul repeats this phrase in his letters, is he really giving the early church a blank check for immorality? Is he saying that all those ancient moral boundaries are just totally gone? Absolutely not. Notice how Paul masterfully uses a rhetorical diatribe here. He isn't declaring a new rule, he is quoting their bad idea to immediately take it down. They say, everything is permissible for me, and Paul counters right back, but not everything is beneficial. They say it again, and he fires back, but I will not be mastered by anything. He's showing them that true Christian liberty is always bounded by self-mastery and the loving edification of others. Unrestrained self-indulgence isn't freedom, it's literally just a new form of slavery. The research points out that we see these exact same targeted boundaries at the famous Acts 15 Jerusalem Council. The early church issued 4 specific prohibitions for non-Jewish believers, avoiding food polluted by idols, sexual immorality, strangled meat, and blood. Now, this is often totally misunderstood as a permanent reduction of ancient law to just 4 arbitrary rules. But they were actually strategic fences. They were designed to disconnect new believers from the intense gravitational pull of the pagan temple complex, allowing Jews and Gentiles to actually share public meals without compromising their holiness. And this really clarifies Paul's overall mission. He wasn't anti-ancient law. He was fiercely against forcing ethnic status conversions, like mandatory circumcision, as a requirement for salvation. He fought against relying on those ethnic boundary markers. But at the exact same time, he fully affirmed voluntary, spirit-led moral obedience to God's ancient instructions. Salvation was by grace, absolutely, but it naturally resulted in a life that honored the moral compass of the Torah. When you step back and put it all together, the source material reveals what it calls an unbroken, progressive thread of God's single promise plan. We go from the foundational Abrahamic promise right through the moral guidance given at Sinai, through the Davidic hope, all the way to the new covenant community empowered by the Spirit. The research powerfully argues that these texts represent one cohesive moral architecture rather than a bunch of opposing forces. So, why does all this matter for us today? It matters because our modern ethical formation still requires boundaries. True liberty is found within the boundaries of love, edification, and self-mastery. This completely challenges our modern cultural assumption that true freedom just means unchecked personal autonomy. Which leaves us with a final, rather provocative thought to consider. If true liberty actually requires moral boundaries that serve communal flourishing, what modern freedoms that we blindly celebrate today might actually be brand new forms of spiritual slavery? It's a question that really makes you rethink everything we've assumed about the enduring wisdom of ancient law. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the narrative.